Dun, dun, dun. Guys, it is time for the comment of the week, and this one's coming from Willie D. Lemon 4132. I don't know if that's how you say it. That's how I'm going to say it. Really enjoyed this one. This is in reference to the podcast that we did with Cody DeQuisto on from Lone Wolf Custom Gear. Really enjoyed this one. I've always been of the mindset that I have to get as high as possible. I'll definitely try hunting lower if the location allows for it. Lots to think about from this one. Watching again and taking some notes. Thanks for the content. Well, I tell you, watch it again. Get them views up. We appreciate it. And I'll tell you what else is up. You're going to get yourself one of these super sweet Vortex Nation podcast hoodies. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm wearing one right now. We're going to reach out to you via YouTube, get all the details squared away. And until then, enjoy the show.
So we have this center of gravity location, which is fixed, and then we have this center of pressure thing. You can view this as the center of gravity is the pivot point. So if you're going to tip the bullet over, it's anchored right there. It's going to rotate around that point. The center of pressure is where you're pushing on the bullet to tip it over.
What is up, everybody? Mr. Ryan Muckenhirn to my right. Ryan, you're drinking a delightful pink lemonade Spindrift, which is, I'd say, possibly appropriate for the conversation that we're going to have by name, possibly appropriate for the conversation we're going to have today, because we're joined virtually by our brother in the Midwest, our favorite ballistician, Mr. Jayden Quinlan from the Hornady company, which we use a lot of their projectiles around here on a daily basis. And going to talk about, we're going to get there. We're going to talk about bullet stability today.
Couple points of order, if I may.
Yes.
Mark is generally very critical when I have any kind of refreshment on the table, regardless of what it is. I call it rules for thee, not for me. Mark always has a refreshment of some kind on the table.
This is I feel like this is an acceptable vessel.
Oh, yeah. Anything Mark brings is good to go. Coffee, water, milk, whatever.
I don't bring milk. I've never had milk on the podcast.
But
and
if
I'm
you
not
did,
anti-milk. I've made that statement clear before.
And I was so nervous about bringing any kind of refreshment to the table. I said to Mark, we have a block here on the screen where if it was the forward-facing camera, I could hide it behind it. I go, is it okay if I have this here and I hide it behind the block? And immediately he's like, no, you can have it up front. And so, okay. Now I know.
It's fitting, guys.
It is.
Spindrift is directly related to bullet stability. So Mark's milk or water or lemonade or whatever soy latte he's drinking over there, it's not. That bullet stability has nothing to do with those beverages. So I'm glad, Ryan, that you have displayed Spindrift properly.
It's and this is a great drink. Comes in a lot of different flavors. I love the name Spindrift. I mean,
speaking of bullets, I felt like there were some shots fired there with this soy latte comment. Also, we don't know. We like the name of this product. We've talked about it at length now. We don't know if they are pro things that do Spindrift or not. So please don't hold that against us if we find out at a later date that they aren't.
Sure.
And I don't know. That's some sort of disclaimer there. But
yeah, I was talking about the Spindrift as it relates to aerodynamics.
Yes. Yeah. No, 100%. Yeah. I just don't want to. I'd be fearful that people are like, you can't promote that product on your. And be like, well, it's happenstance in the name. Jayden, how you been, man?
Good. Very good. Super busy. Weather's starting to cool off around here. I'm sure it is for you guys too. So hunting season is approaching, which is always awesome.
It is.
But I've been doing good.
Nice. Yeah, it's in the air. It wasn't last week when it was like 90 degrees for an entire week here. Yeah. But, boy, like you said, temperatures dropped, cooled off, and, I think everybody's getting that itch to get out and hit the woods. And
we picked up 8 inches of rain on Friday and Saturday, which was just...
In 2 days?
Yeah, just delightful. Wow. Actually, it was like a 12-hour period, and that certainly helped. The mornings
sitting on pool noodles right now?
It was pretty rough for a while there. There's a lot of water. And we had a very unseasonably wet spring. We had 20-some inches of rain in May and 20-some inches of rain in June.
But I'd say July and August have been
dry.
So that rain was welcome. It definitely all kind of came at once there. But it's okay because duck season opens this weekend, Ryan, for us in our region. And a place where I was thinking about going didn't have enough water to paddle back in. And
I have a surplus.
Now I'd be certain that I do have enough water to paddle back in. So.
Phenomenal.
Ryan, you were going to say something. You had to I
have a Spindrift relay. Well, first I have a product plug.
That's what I was getting at.
New Hornady product I've been working with. And then I have a question about spin stabilization with that particular projectile. Okay. So a good friend of mine drew a New Mexico elk tag muzzleloader. And so he's setting up a peep gun, and he wanted it as lethal as possible to the furthest range that I could make this muzzleloader function to. So it's a Remington 700 UML. He's got an Arrowhead module conversion installed. And so we enter the chat of projectile selection. Very typically, muzzleloader projectiles off shelf are less than desirable from like an aerodynamic standpoint. But I got a pack of your new ELD-X muzzleloader projectiles. A few things right off the bat. Most consistent load pressure of any non-bore sized muzzleloader I've ever used. Absolutely slick. Accuracy was bonkers out of that peep. Yeah. Bonkers. And I'm able for as massy as that projectile is, because it is heavy. I mean, it's a 340 grain projectile, right? Not 320, 340. Using a stout charge of Blackhorn 209, but not an absurd charge of Blackhorn 209. I'm into the 1900s with it. And he and I were shooting it to 300 on Sunday. And man, does that thing shoot. With respect to that projectile, because now I'm rethinking all the projectiles that I use currently in muzzleloaders, most of which I'm sizing, swaging down to just below bore diameter. And then having to use like an over powder wad. Like this seems like the turnkey solution, and the accuracy's just been nuts. Do you know what is the slowest twist I can get away with shooting that projectile?
Off the top of my head, no. But generally when a question is asked like that about what is the absolute limit for my application, you have to bring in some other pieces of information.
Sure.
You have to bring in what velocity you're shooting it at,
yep,
and what the atmospheric conditions are, the
Understood.
temperature, pressure, and humidity. So to really nail it down, you have to have that. But,
Understood.
Yeah.
Well, out of the 700 UML, which is back into production, which is great. It's a great muzzleloader. That's kind of the bullet, I think.
Yeah.
Yep. That was phenomenal.
And you can also experimentally test it.
Sure.
So you can run a calculator, right? I'm sure we'll talk about some of that stuff in this subject, but the calculator is calculating based off of a bunch of data points or whatever. But you can always confirm that by testing. And typically what you'll see is before a bullet starts to go gyroscopically unstable, you're going to see the dispersion start to increase.
Sure.
So it'll shoot very consistently as you're approaching the limit, and then right before you get to the limit where a bullet wouldn't be gyroscopically stable, your groups are going to start to open up. That's an indication that you're approaching the line.
Understood.
Gotcha. And when I say open up, I mean like double, triple, 5, 10x the dispersion you were seeing before.
Gotcha. Well, that's definitely an interesting case study that you're working with, Ryan.
And I'm talking, I was shooting another muzzleloader that same night. That was a CVA Paramount with a different projectile. And that one had an optic on it, and I was appreciating better accuracy with the peep gun.
Interesting.
It was
That's cool.
Phenomenal.
Quick reminder, everybody, to check out the really cool elk hunting video we did with Mr. Remy Warren. You can watch it on the Vortex Nation YouTube channel. But associated with this video, we have the Ultimate Elk Hunting Gear giveaway that you are going to want to enter. We're talking gear from Vortex, Weatherby, Silencer Central, Decked, and Argali. Guys, this is a lot of great gear. And if you don't throw your name in the hat, you won't be eligible. Entering is easy. Just go to join.vtxnation.com. Giveaway runs through October 27 of 2024. Guys, that's coming up. Enter today. Enjoy the show. Jayden, before we get too deep in the weeds, which I think we may already have, I mean, what is bullet stability, and why is it important?
Yeah, good question. So bullet stability is tied into rifling, right? If you go back to the age before rifling, when we're shooting smooth, round musket balls, they didn't shoot all that great or all that far, predictably, reliably, precisely. So when rifling hits the scene, the fact that spinning a bullet makes it more consistent in a whole bunch of different metrics, that's really the start of the bullet stability conversation. There's two types of stability. There's gyroscopic stability, and that's generally what people are referencing when they just say bullet stability is the gyroscopic stability. And that means that the bullet is flying point forward as it was designed, right? It's not tumbling end over end. It's not flipping over and then flying backwards. It's flying in the orientation it was designed to fly in. And then there's a second one called dynamic stability, which is a little bit less known, and that gets into the specific ways that the bullet is reacting to the forces that are acting on it. And although it's still flying point forward, dynamic stability deals more with the pitching and yawing motion that a bullet nose has. So it kind of wobble, like the amount of bullet wobble it has. And whether that's staying the same, getting worse, getting better, that's what dynamic stability is.
Gotcha. And then by the word dynamic, that'll be changing throughout I guess they both are changing throughout the bullets as it passes through the air.
Yep, they're in a constant rate of change. That's right.
Gotcha. How does one achieve proper bullet stability?
Well, you have to overcome the forces that are trying to tip the bullet over, because a bullet doesn't want to fly point forward because the center of pressure and the center of gravity. So I'll use an arrow as an analogy here because it's the inverse of it, right? We don't have to spin an arrow for it to be stable, like in archery. The fletchings or the fins on the back of an arrow cause the center of pressure of the arrow. So this is like this, point within the arrow where all of the aerodynamic forces are acting through. So the main one you have is like the drag force, right? Like the projectile is moving through the air and it's bumping into all these air molecules in front of it and moving them out of the way. And those air molecules have mass, and so that's going to give it drag, right? Well, with that arrow, you don't have to spin it because the fletchings on the back cause the center of pressure to be behind the center of gravity. So it doesn't really want to tip over at all. But with a bullet, as we're used to it in small arms, it's the complete opposite. The center of pressure is in front of the center of gravity. And so if you shot a bullet with no spin, it's just going to tumble end over end over end over end. It's kind of like if you threw a football with no spiral, what would that football do? It would go end over end over end, right? And a football's kind of similar shape to a bullet, so you can use that as an analogy. But the fact that bullet is spinning gives it essentially an axis of stability. And if you use a bicycle example, because most of us have experience with that, the slower you ride a bicycle, the easier it is to tip over, to fall over, right? But the faster you go, the harder it is to fall over, right? The more stable you are. So the rate at which that bullet is spinning is directly related to how stable it is or how much it can resist tipping over. The same way you would on a bike, the bullet's experiencing the same thing. So how do you get a bullet to be stable? You spin it fast enough that it can overcome the forces that are acting to tip it over.
Very
Did that answer it?
Yeah, it does. The bicycle one got me. Like, that's when it started clicking for me.
For me, it was the football one, because when I throw a football, I've heard it referred to as a duck. So
you have low gyroscopic stability when you throw a football around. Yeah,
that was my whole problem.
So the duck wobble in your football throwing, Ryan, is a great example of the dynamic stability. Yeah. It's not the same thing as dynamic stability of a bullet, but you still have spiral or that football is still rotating when you throw it, right? But it's kind of like wobbling all over the place. that football is not really dynamically stable.
Understood.
If it was, that amount of wobble that it had would be getting smaller. It would be turning into the perfect spiral.
That brings up a question. This is a Mythbusters question, if you will. When I was growing up in the gun shop, I would hear people talk about certain cartridges, to name a few, 338 Lapua and 50 BMG, and needing distance with those cartridges to, quote, let those bullets go to sleep where they'll shoot better. From your seat, would you say that if we were firing, say, a 750 grain AMAX at an appropriate velocity and an appropriately twisted 50 Browning bore, does that bullet go to sleep after a certain distance? Or
what do you mean by go to sleep?
well, so the statement was a 50 BMG or a 338 Lapua cannot be accurate inside of a given distance.
I've heard people say that before, like, "Oh man, it's not accurate at 100, but it straightens out at 4."
Yeah, you gotta give it distance to let it go to sleep, and the bullet snaps into attention and then tracks true. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have quite a few thoughts on that. The statement overall is false.
Okay.
So from your Mythbuster opening there, from the standpoint of point of impact or dispersion or group size, right? It's never going to get better. Yeah. And I have this question posed, every year or two, especially at a show. Some guy will come up and be like, "How is it?" And he'll show me a picture. "How is it that this gun shoots 1.5 inches at 100 and then 1 inch at 200? That bullet's going to sleep." It's like, okay, the bullet going to sleep thing is where the truth lies in that statement. The falsehood is in the dispersion or the cone of fire gets better. No, that doesn't happen. The growth of your bullet's position in the group. So let's just say you shoot a group and you have a shot that's high and low, right, within that group. Those two are on a vector path. They're always going to be moving away from each other. And the farther out you go, the farther from the center they will go. It's a function of time thing. Now, the true part of the statement, the bullet going to sleep, yes, bullets do go to sleep in the use of that simple term, in that every bullet that comes out of the muzzle is going to have some amount of pitch and yaw to it, or angular rate movement is the angular rate is the more technical term for it. But the bullet's always going to come out with its nose either a little bit up, a little bit down, a little bit right, a little bit left, or somewhere in between on a clock orientation. And if that bullet is properly designed and is fired out of the correct conditions, the twist rate and all of that kind of thing, the angle that it has will get smaller. So typically there's a term in a little bit more advanced ballistic stuff that's called first max yaw. And the first max yaw is generally, it's within a couple hundred yards. In most cases, it's 10 to 70 yards down range. And that's the point. So the bullet comes out. As soon as the bullet comes out, it's no longer supported by the barrel anymore, right? Once it comes out, it's free to move in 6 different degrees. 6 degrees of freedom. You probably have heard that term somewhere. Well, those 6 degrees can be broken down into the easy 3. That's up, down, elevation, left, right, windage, and forward and back, range. The 3 that we're always worried about in shooting, right? The other 3 is pitch. So that's the bullet's nose orientation up and down, like pitch with an airplane. A lot of people have probably heard that. Yaw is the left and right orientation of the bullet's nose. And then roll, or rotation, spin. So that's pretty easy, right? That's the 6 different ways a bullet can move. When it comes out of the muzzle and it's no longer supported by the barrel, generally that bullet is going to have a little bit of pitch and a little bit of yaw to some extent, because when a bullet goes down the barrel, it's not perfectly straight. A bullet can engrave crooked and it kind of goes down the barrel crooked and it comes out crooked. When that happens and the bullet's now free of the muzzle, it's going to have a response that generally will cause the nose to kind of wake up, and it's got this wobble pattern, and at the max wobble that it has, that's where the first max yaw would be. And a dynamically stable bullet, that yaw will damp itself out. It will get smaller. It'll generally never completely go away, but it will get very, very small. And we're talking orders of like tens to hundreds of a degree. Like you couldn't even see it. If you could freeze the bullet like 3 inches out of the muzzle and look, kind of look down the barrel like, oh yeah, I see the straight line here. Is the bullet, like cockeyed in relation to the straight line of the barrel? No, you won't see it, but it's there, and it is measurable in with some instrumentation, like some measurement tools, but generally we definitely don't have them at like the hobbyist or recreational or hunter or competitor. Nobody has that stuff. It's essentially the government that has the labs capable of being able to see and measure those angles.
Wow.
Yeah. That was.
Did that answer your
absolutely
question?
Did, yeah. I'm just thinking about how interesting your job is, in that of course, you're doing a ton of work in modeling with math and physics, but then you shoot it, and then you have that time and space between muzzle and target, which we as a species can't necessarily easily observe, like what something's doing, and you're like, oh wow, that's the space you occupy, and that's a fun. It's
thing.
Awesome.
There's still mysteries unsolved too. Why did that happen?
Yep.
And it's pretty cool.
Yeah, no doubt.
So a higher twist rate, which would actually yield a lower number, or be noted by a lower number, like an 8 twist would actually be a higher twist rate than like a 10.
Faster.
Or faster, I should say.
You want me to throw a curveball at you?
Yeah.
So we think of things in twist rate, right? How many inches per revolution does the rifle? How many inches does it take for the rifling to make one full revolution? Right. That's what an 8 twist means, or a 10 twist, or whatever. That's not necessarily what matters. It's what's called calibers per revolution.
Oh.
So it's the twist rate combined with the caliber of the bullet that's really the number that matters.
Then why on like every calculator that I've ever used, it just says enter the twist rate number?
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
Well, because it needs that, right? It does need that. But as far as from a like if you were to try to make comparisons of things, right? Because let's take an 8 twist, right? We see an 8 twist in a 30 caliber. Right? Say a 300 PRC with an 8 twist. They're out there. And then we see an 8 twist with a 6.5 Creedmoor.
Mm-hmm.
Those are not the same thing as far as how the bullet is responding aerodynamically. You have to go to calibers per revolution to then start to segregate the differences out. And what you end up seeing is that from a caliber standpoint, the 8 twist in the 30 cal is significantly faster than the 8 twist in the 6.5.
So number one, how do you find out your calibers per revolution? And then what is happening in that instant, or like when you're talking about that?
So you would take your twist rate and divide it by your caliber.
Okay.
Like exit pupil.
That's how you get calibers per revolution.
Okay.
But that allows you to start to normalize what would be the equal twist rate. So if I took the 30, well, here, I'll just do it. Let me grab my phone because I'm not that good at math. So let's take that 300 PRC example, right? So we're going to take an 8 twist divided by 0.3. So that's 26.66 calibers per revolution. And then we'll take that 8 twist and divide it by 256, which would be the bore diameter, technically the caliber of a 6.5. That's 31.25. So there's from the standpoint of how fast the bullet is rotating as a function of its diameter, it's two totally different numbers.
Sure.
But when we think of twist rate, we're like, oh, it's an 8 twist and an 8 twist. That's the same thing. That's not the same thing to the bullet.
I suppose that's why when, like in this very specific example, when you hear about an 8 twist 30, you're like, whoa, that's a fast 30.
Oh, true.
And then with an 8 twist 6.5, you're like, oh, it's a standard. Or like an 8 twist 224. That's these days pretty common.
Okay, that is
stability. The way, so your other question, Mark, was, well, why do I just enter a twist rate? And a lot of that depends on the stability calculator that you're using. They're not all the same.
Well, and I guess I've entered in that calculator or whatever you're doing, you've entered the twist rate, but you've also entered the diameter of the projectile too. So maybe it's just accounting for those things.
Yeah, it can calculate that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Some will, you said, not all necessarily.
Yeah, because some of them, some bullet stability calculators that are out there will use like a layman's formula, like a really easy to calculate formula. So like you've probably heard of, have you heard of the Greenhill formula?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So Greenhill came up with that formula. Man, I don't have the dates off the top of my head here, but it's late 1800s, early 1900s. And he essentially figured out this relationship in that, hey, when I shoot this bullet out of this barrel, everything is fine, but I shoot this different bullet out of this barrel and it's keyholing. I can't hit anything. The groups are huge, right? So he started to come up with like this basic formula that could be used to figure out, well, is the bullet going to be okay or not in this twist rate barrel? That was later morphed into, or a better version came out in the Miller stability formula. A lot more people will probably have heard of that one. Don Miller's stability formula rule. I think he published that in Precision Shooting Magazine in the late 90s or early 2000s. I can't remember exactly when. The Miller stability formula knows a couple different things about your bullet. It knows how much it weighs. It knows the diameter. It knows the length, right? Generally, you have to put in a bullet length on a lot of those calculators. And then it knows the twist rate. Well, gyroscopic stability isn't necessarily a function of all those things. And you can prove this to yourself in that I can take a 6.5, 160 grain round nose bullet. And that bullet has a longer length than, let's say, 120 or a 130 CX, maybe a 130 CX, right? I can shoot that 160 round nose, probably even out of a 10 twist, definitely out of a 9 twist, right? I'd have to run those numbers to give you the exact one. But can I shoot that 130 CX out of a 9 twist or a 10 twist? No way, right? That bullet will not be stable. So that in itself proves to you the limitation of that method. That it's not about bullet length. Now, it generally trends that way, that the longer the bullet gets, the faster you have to spin it, but that's not how it works. Gyroscopic stability, the actual equation to execute the equations of motion, I'm going to pull up my little reference here. You have to know the transverse inertia of the bullet, the axial inertia of the bullet, the density of the air that it's flying through, the pitching moment, the velocity, the diameter. All of that stuff has to be included to tell you whether it's going to be gyroscopically stable or not. Well, there's no way for you to know that stuff. You don't know the inertias of your bullet or the pitching moment at whatever Mach number that you're working with. So that the methods used to calculate have been truncated for ease of use, but they leave a lot on the table for the accuracy of the calculation. And that would be the example I'd give you in like the 160 round nose versus the 130 CX. So to correctly calculate gyroscopic stability, you have to know quite a bit about the bullet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff I don't know.
You still make that 160 round nose, don't you?
Yep, I shot some last week.
Did you really? Yeah. If I ever find my coveted 1903 Mannlicher Schoenauer carbine in 6.5 by 54, that's the bullet. That is the one.
Yeah, if you like flying hot dogs, that's those old round noses.
They are
crack
comical,
me up,
man.
When you look at them in contrast to the bullets that we have available today, and how like aerodynamic and just they're built to the tilt as far as performance, And then you look at that sucker and you're like, man, this is like the big brute guy in the back of the bar that just does everything with brute force.
Can I ask what you were shooting it out of?
That was my next question.
A 6.5 Creedmoor.
Oh, no kidding. Well, why not?
Just cause, or you had a special application?
I was R&D-ing some things, you could say.
Okay.
I was doing some testing.
I understand. Yeah, it's cool. Yeah.
When it comes to bullet profile, you were talking about those two projectiles, and maybe you just covered it and I missed it. Is one of those bullet profiles more or less stable?
Yeah, great question. So I'll try to give you an analogy here, and hopefully it'll make sense to describe like how a bullet would be tipped over if it was unstable. So you have the center of gravity of the bullet. That's pretty easy to figure out, right? It's built of certain materials, and it's a certain shape. So the center of gravity is a fixed location on the bullet. That's not going to change. the center of pressure is in a constant state of change. The center of pressure, which is the point at which the bullet's trying to be tipped over through, that's in a constant state of change. But let me back up just a second. So we have this center of gravity location, which is fixed, and then we have this center of pressure thing. You can view this as the center of gravity is the pivot point. So if you're going to tip the bullet over, it's anchored right there. It's going to rotate around that point. The center of pressure is where you're pushing on the bullet to tip it over. Does that kind of make sense so far?
Certainly.
Now, the distance between those two things, the center of gravity and the center of pressure, is a length, right? It's a lever arm. It's a pry bar. We've all used a pry bar, leverage, right? So if you view stability from the standpoint of it's going to pivot around the center of gravity, but my hand that's on the end of the pry bar is pressing at the center of pressure. That's where the force is being applied. So what happens if the center of gravity and the center of pressure are farther away from each other and my pry bar gets longer? What happens?
Easier to tip it.
Easier to tip it. And if it gets shorter,
Harder.
the inverse, right? So it would require more force to tip it over if the pry bar was shorter. Well, the bullet's shape directly plays into where the center of pressure is located. And so to your question mark on do different profiles change it? Absolutely. The more aerodynamic that thing gets, the more forward that center of pressure will move, the farther away from the center of gravity. And generally what you see is as bullets get heavier for caliber and more aerodynamic, they're very long and sleek, you have to shoot them out of faster or slower twist rates.
Understood.
Faster.
Faster, right?
Yeah.
Now, the other part of this, and this kind of reverts back to your opening question, Ryan, or talking about that muzzle loader, and I brought in temperature and pressure, and those considerations would have to be made. So that center of pressure, the location that it is at is a function of three different things. One of them is the bullet's shape. We just kind of talked about that. So that's kind of a fixed contribution, right? Because the bullet's shape is its shape. It's not going to change shape on its way to the target. So the influence it had on where the center of pressure is a one and done thing. Now, the next two are not. The next one is the density of the air that it's traveling through. So that's temperature and pressure and humidity. The more or less dense the air is, the more it will move that center of pressure location. So it could make the pry bar longer or it could make it shorter just based on the density of the air. The third one is velocity. So the faster that bullet is going, the stronger the force is acting on the pry bar. Because the force acting on the pry bar is all that air that the bullet is traveling through. So the faster you go through it, the more resistance there is, the more strength there is to tip it over. So those three things in combination give you the center of pressure location specifically. And that then defines the pry bar length. So if you spin it fast enough that the arm pressing on the pry bar isn't strong enough to tip it over, it will forever be gyroscopically stable. And if you think about that, it's like, okay, well, that kind of makes sense, but how does that work? We said that the center of gravity location is fixed, and we said that the center of pressure is from three different things, one of which is fixed, the bullet shape, but the other two, air density and velocity. Does your air density change very much between you and the target?
Not likely.
Not much, especially if you're shooting flat fire, right? Like you're not shooting dramatically uphill or downhill at a really long target. You'll experience air density changes there, certainly. But let's just say we're out on a flat range, we're just practicing. The density of the air between you and the target isn't changing very much at all. And so that's essentially a fixed number as far as where it positions the center of pressure. So the third one is velocity, and velocity is in a constant state of change. As soon as the bullet comes out of the barrel, it starts slowing down. It's no longer being accelerated by the burning propellant. It's going to continue to slow down until it comes to a stop, whatever that is, whether it hits the ground and stops or it hits a target and stops, whatever it is. Well, that velocity constantly changing means that the center of pressure location is constantly changing. If the center of pressure location is constantly changing, the pry bar length is constantly changing. And what you see happen is as the velocity starts to slow down, the center of pressure moves away from the center of gravity. That makes your pry bar longer. So you would think it would be easier for the bullet to tip over the longer it's in the air because that pry bar got longer, right? But remember, the strength of the arm that's pressing on the pry bar is the velocity and the air density. So the velocity is bleeding off so quickly, that arm trying to tip the bullet over is getting weak at a way faster rate than the pry bar is getting longer. And that's why a bullet becomes more gyroscopically stable as a function of time as it goes downrange.
Wild. It does make sense.
Yeah.
Good.
I mean, I'll have to listen slash watch this like 10 more times, but when we got to the end of that, I was like, oh yeah.
Well, that analogy is like 2 decades worth of thinking and trying to understand. So hopefully it helps. But yeah, first pass at it, it's not an easy nut to crack.
Can you, and if you can, what is the result, I guess, quotation mark, overstabilize a bullet? And then in some ways, like, well, why not just twist everything real fast?
Yeah. Can you have too much fun, right?
Yeah.
You certainly can. So there's a couple things that can happen with spinning a bullet too fast. One is you can see an increase in your dispersion or your group sizes. And that comes from, I'm not saying that you absolutely will, but you certainly can. So any imperfections that are in the bullet, as far as where the mass is laid out within it, are going to be made worse by spinning it faster. So when you make a bullet, you take a copper cup, which is, think of it like a cereal bowl made of copper, and you're going to take that and you're going to smash it with a punch down into a die that causes that cup or bowl to stretch out into like a water glass for height, right? And so as you do that, that copper material is moving. If it moves more on one side than the other, or it becomes thicker on one side than the other, then that's going to take that lead core, which is really high density. That's heavy, right? That's what gives our bullet its weight. It's going to take it and shift it off to one side. And that takes that center of gravity that we were just talking about earlier, and it shifts it off the center line of the bullet. So it essentially acts like an out-of-balance tire. When we have an out-of-balance tire, it's tied to an axle, so that's a little bit of a different situation. But what happens when your tire's out of balance?
A lot of wobble when you're driving.
What's the difference in wobble when you're driving slow speed versus high speed and higher? What happens with the wobble?
Increases the faster we move.
Right.
Yeah.
Same thing with the bullet. So if that bullet has a little imperfection, the faster we spin it, the worse the wobble becomes.
Yeah, sure.
And that wobble, and I'm using, kind of generic terms here, but that wobble, the worse that wobble is, the worse your groups will be. So if you spin a bullet too fast, you can have that. Another downside of spinning a bullet too fast is from a terminal performance standpoint. Bullets are designed to expand at a certain rate. And generally they're designed for an application out of a specific cartridge or maybe family of cartridges. And generally the twist rate of those is very similar, if not the same. Well, part of the way a bullet expands is not only the force of it hitting the terminal media, let's say ballistics gelatin, causing it to open up and mushroom out, but it's also the rotational velocity it has. So if you make dramatic changes, if you went to a way slower twist rate and the bullet was still stable, you would see that it would take longer for your bullet to fully mushroom. If you go to a really, really fast twist rate, that happens more rapidly. You don't really have an increase in outward energy from the rotation, but what you do have is a change in the rate of the expansion, how quickly it reaches the diameter that it's going to achieve. So you could see differences there. And then the final place that you can kind of have too much twist rate is from a bullet integrity standpoint. And this is mainly with like a lead core copper jacketed bullet. If you spin them too fast, they can essentially torque apart in the barrel. They can create a crack or a fissure, and when they come out, when they're on their way to the target, they can come apart.
It's dramatic. I have
yes
experienced and witnessed both that, and it's very interesting to see. A little disheartening when you're on the clock and you're trying to win a 3-gun match, and all of a sudden your bullets are turned into vapor 30 yards down range. But it is neat to watch.
Right.
It's a fascinating thing.
A lot of guys, a lot of people will look at the things that the twist rate impacts and they'll say, oh, well, terminal performance-wise, that's a huge benefit because the bullet's reaching its maximum diameter sooner, meaning I'm departing more energy into the terminal media sooner. The wound channel gets bigger. It's more attractive. But the downside, you can take that so far to the point where the front end of the bullet that's designed to expand just it shears off, and you just have this shank. And now that bullet's not working as designed anymore.
Yep.
And then there can be some aerodynamic advantages to spinning a bullet faster, certainly. There's certain bullets that as they transition from supersonic into subsonic, or supersonic into transonic and subsonic flight, spinning them faster can help with dynamic stability in some bullets, but it's not an across-the-board thing. And then in the back of your head, you always have that possible increase in dispersion that comes along with it. So it's really a balancing act on not all the trade-offs are positive, not all the trade-offs are negative. You just have to figure out what is your application, what are you willing to tolerate for that relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Jayden, can you go into a little bit what's happening to a bullet when it's in that period of going transonic, and then I guess beyond that as well?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions about that transonic region of a bullet's flight, and I believe that a lot of it is due to the failure of ballistic coefficient as a calculation method. Because generally where we see that start to happen, and what I mean by that statement is when I use a ballistic coefficient-based calculator, everything is pretty good. My predictions that it's giving me and the reality, the point of impacts that I'm seeing on target, those two things are matching up very well out to a certain point. And then you start to see them fall apart, and they get worse and worse and worse, and then sometimes they'll come back together again and get better. Generally, that's associated with that transonic region. But it's not necessarily that. It's that enough time has elapsed that the errors are starting to show themselves between the program and what you're shooting. So it's not necessarily that the bullet is going crazy in transonic flight. It's that enough time has elapsed for the bullet to get to the point where the program is no longer predicting it correctly, and you're seeing differences. Now, a lot of people associate that as a transonic bullet stability issue, dynamic stability, because it can happen. And there's some pretty notorious cases of it. The 168 Match King out of a 12-twist barrel is pretty well known, especially because it was used so heavily in the military sniping communities for many years, that the effective range was 800 meters. Because outside of that, your point of impacts became wild and variable, and you had no effective range past that. Well, that bullet suffers from dynamic stability in the correct circumstances, twist rate and all of that stuff. And the dynamic stability issue it usually comes from a thing called Magnus. Have you guys heard of the Magnus force? Mm-hmm. So that's a pitcher throws a curveball, right? We're all probably familiar with that concept. That's essentially a result or visual of the Magnus force in action. So when you have a rotating object, which a bullet and a baseball are, when a pitcher throws a curveball, there's a certain amount of that air that's around the bullet that is skin friction. It's kind of attached to that bullet, right? And so as it's spinning around, that air is kind of following the rotation of the bullet because of the contact between the air molecules and the surface of the bullet. Well, when our bullet is being fired, especially at longer ranges, it's starting to drop more and more and more as it slows down, right? So if you think of it in like 100-yard chunks, the amount of bullet drop from 0 to 100 compared to 900 to 1,000, two totally different environments, right? Because the time it takes that bullet to traverse those 100 yards from 900 to 1,000 takes it way longer because it's slowed down so much compared to that 0 to 100. So as that bullet is starting to fall more and more, you start to... that air that's attached to the surface of the bullet as it's rotating, as it's falling down, that means there's going to be a little bit more air pressure on the bottom side of the bullet versus the top, right? Because it's coming down through the air. And then you have this air that's attached to the surface of the bullet. And if it's a right-hand rotating bullet, which most of our barrels are, that means that air that's attached to it's going to come around and kind of crash into that little bit higher pressure air on the bottom of the bullet. And that can induce what's called the Magnus force. And that will cause, without getting super in the weeds, that will cause your angle of attack to increase. So the bullet might have gone to sleep after the muzzle, right? Had its first max yaw and it went to sleep, and now it just has this tiny little wobble. And then as that starts to happen, that level of wobble can start to increase. And you see an increase in drag in that area, and you can see some kind of randomized point of impact variations. But I say that to contrast it with most people's experience. Have you ever shot a 5.56 out of a, say, 14.5 inch or shorter barrel to 600 yards successfully? You can successfully hit a target repeatedly?
I mean, I hit it, but I wouldn't say that it
I'm
was.
not saying like shooting a tiny little group,
Yeah.
but is it like hit and then one bullet's 5 mils that way and one's 7 mils that way type
Yes.
stuff?
Yeah. That's what I experienced.
Okay, then you might have had that.
Yeah.
Have you ever shot a 308 past 1,000 and successfully hit targets?
Same situation.
Yeah. So you're saying you've never been able to hit targets past 1,000?
No, I have, but
Oh, you
sporadic,
have.
erratic. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's an indication that those bullets are successfully transitioning into you're well into subsonic flight with a 308 well past 1,000, right? And so I say that because this transonic region gets a lot of attention, and it's like an excuse bucket, right? So when something happens downrange that we don't expect to, or we were unsuccessful, we missed the target, immediately, guys, I see it all the time, they'll say, oh, well, that bullet's in transonic. Can't trust anything that's going on. We have a big Doppler radar that we use for R&D, and we can see the velocity of that bullet as it goes up, as far as we can see it with the radar. And I've seen dynamic instability, or a bullet going crazy dynamically unstable, significantly less than 1% of the time.
Really?
It's pretty rare.
So you're saying it was me?
It can happen. Well, what I'm saying is that's a whole nother topic about all the things that would need to be accounted for there. But what a lot of people do is they say, oh, it's in the transonic and the bullet becomes stable in transonic. Not necessarily true. Certainly not gyroscopically unstable in transonic. It's way more gyroscopically stable in transonic than it was at supersonic because the bullet's continuing to slow down. Dynamic stability wise, it can happen if the design of the bullet is a certain way and the twist rate and the environment that it's flying through, all of those boxes get checked, you can have dynamic instability. But in a lot of cases, it's misinterpreted.
Sure.
Would it be fair to say that at least sometimes it's being, falsely accused, and possibly the perpetrators? I mean, like when we shoot at those longer ranges, we're oftentimes outside. We have environmentals like wind, the dreaded wind, and you're like, oh, it's unstable, but it's just like, well, you're just more affected by things like wind at those differences. I mean, would that?
Sure.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, your sensitivity of everything goes up as a function of time. So that means velocity variation, drag variation, wind variation, human error, right? Your ability, just from an aiming error standpoint, and you guys know more about this than I do in the optics industry, but your ability to tolerate mirage from an aiming error standpoint at 100 or 200 yards versus 1,300 yards, that's totally different, right? So the farther out it gets, it's time, not distance, but the farther out it gets, the more influential each one of those little metrics becomes. And any variance in those things becomes a bigger variance in your result.
Yeah, I would say the last time Mark and I were doing something like that, we were shooting 308 to 1050 out of a 20-inch bolt gun. And we were shooting a 168, like typical match profile projectile. And the big tell for me was the chronograph data. When I was looking at ESs and SDs that were deep into the double digits. And so to your point, and this is eye-opening for me, is like, oh, I'm sitting there in the back of my head thinking like, oh, that must be definitely that transonic region and into sub, because we were hitting that threshold at probably about 800. I'd have to look back at the data. And then I know that at plate, the calculated impact velocity was somewhere around 1050 to 1070. Well, if I have an SD or an ES that's, especially the ES, if I had 100 foot per second ES, which is not out of the realm of normalcy with some factory loaded ammunition, that I had no control over what went into it. Like I'm not surprised that I have a different elevation and wind call, because the influences of drop and wind on that projectile moving 100 feet per second different than the one fired before it or the one after it. Yeah,
right.
I mean, for sure. That's a it's an important note for people who are thinking about shooting long range. Make sure you get a good sample size of your ammunition so you can understand where that will take effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's pretty common that we'll see somebody be shooting well into transonic or into subsonic successfully with whatever the system is, right? Like a 20-inch 308, if you drove those extreme spread and standard deviations down to precision shooting style levels, probably going to hit that target repeatedly. So you can successfully do that. But then with this other system, as soon as something happens that doesn't match our expectations, a lot of folks from the information they've traditionally had will immediately say, oh, it's because it's going transonic. I call it transonic gremlins to make a joke about how overused the term is. Like there's these little gremlins that come out of the woodwork and like move your bullet around on you. Like,
That'd be a fun infographic. Really. Yeah. They go up and just kind of tap it. It flies off course. That's a transonic gremlin. A TG.
There you go.
Yeah.
The old TGs.
Yeah,
They'll get you.
They do. Don't feed them after midnight. Is that how it goes?
I think so.
Yeah. Mark, I have more questions.
Please go ahead.
So past 5 to 7 years, for us as an industry, we've had some phenomenal cartridge and bullet technology come out, and I'm seeing like new life being like breathed into kind of old cartridges. Like a great example, 7PRC, right? So intelligent cartridge design, an update to a very dated 7 Rem mag, better bullets, better relationship between cartridge case and bullet diameter and then bullet mass. And as a result, we're seeing faster twist rates on like hunting rifles, right? So 175s, 180s, the 160CX. And we're getting cartridges in that same class and format to do things that their predecessors just simply couldn't unless they were like heavily customized, right? Is that, in your opinion, the trend that we're going to see moving forward as shooters with cartridge design moving up?
That's a good question. If there's enough significant holes or gaps between the legacy cartridge and what it has traditionally done versus what the demands are of capability, yeah, you'll probably continue to see new ones.
Sure.
I mean, we've been pretty successful taking that 6.5 Creedmoor concept and just, there's a hole over here. Like, yeah, why can't I shoot a 175 ELD-X out of a factory hunting rifle and find factory ammo at Sportsman's or Cabela's or wherever? It's dumb that I can't do that. Let's fix that.
Yeah.
You know?
And to no detriment to the shooter that I've been able to necessarily understand or see. And actually, Mark and I were just having this conversation about what we'll call old cartridges, right? And I'm thinking like 257 Weatherby, 25-06, 270 Winchester, 7 Rem mag. They're all fine cartridges, right? They have done the job for sometimes the better part of a century and left very little on the table. But what Hornady ushered into the consumer space, especially with the 6.5 Creedmoor, and I'm not saying that was the definitive start to this trend, but for me personally, that was my awakening and awareness to that kind of thing. Like everything that has come out after that especially that you folks have put out, has followed that same model of efficiency plus benefit in projectile design, profile, mass. And then overall, like the end result is just capability given to the shooter. I'm not sad about this, but I think it's that thought process is really going to leave some of those older cartridges in the dust. I mean, because you're solving such a much larger, broad swath of problems that would have existed otherwise with these newer projectiles that just in turn require faster twist. But yeah, I mean, to Mark's earlier question is, well, why don't we just twist it faster? It seems to be that fixes a lot of problems. Of course, you need a bullet that'll do it and a cartridge that'll handle it. But
right. All the things that are building that cartridge relationship to be working together optimally.
Yeah, when I look at
the cartridge and chamber need to be working in alignment for what your end goal is performance wise.
Certainly. Yeah. Very few problems that a cartridge like a 6.5, either Creedmoor PRC or 7 PRC or 300 PRC don't solve. Like, and again, with what detriment to the shooter? Very little to none, right?
Right, because then it's available to everybody.
Yeah.
Where, to your opening point, that used to only be available to the guy that had the money and resources to go have a custom gun built.
Yep.
And maybe he used a traditional cartridge. Maybe he used a 270 and he put a faster twist on it and he changed the reamer dimensions so that he could use this, certain bullet at this certain length or whatever. But that's not available to the majority or the average either hunter or recreational shooter. And so that was kind of the goal, was let's take that level of capability and give it to everybody.
I was going through some of my notes here, and it made one of your earlier points. I'm like, yeah, then that makes the why behind it makes more sense. Of course, I'll probably say this, and you're like, well, no. But it said, stability is, better or, more easily achieved at like higher elevations and higher air temperatures. And I would assume that's due to just less resistance. Yeah.
That's right. Yep. The strength of the arm pressing on the pry bar is weaker because the air is not as dense. The bullet is not impacting as many air molecules in the same amount of distance traveled.
This is also cool.
I should do all my load development and publishing of data at 14,000 feet.
Just inflate the numbers a little bit.
Yeah.
You know what I'm getting?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you'd be ready for that Marco hunt,
Yeah. When I go on that Marco Polo, because that's at 16,000 feet. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a great point, Mark, that I'm sure some of the listeners might benefit from, in that, a lot of times you'll see twist rate recommendations. Like you see it from us, you see it from other bullet manufacturers, whether generally it's not in ammo, because ammo is tied to a cartridge and chamber, which is tied to a twist rate of a barrel. So generally that's kind of done for you, right? If you go buy a box of 7 PRC, you don't have to go check the barrel on a factory-made 7 PRC rifle to make sure the twist rate is fast enough for that, right? Like all of that was done in tandem, so it's correct. But a guy that wants to shoot, we did the 6.5 the ELD VTs last year, which is a very long, sleek, aerodynamic varmint bullet. Well, varmint hunting is kind of synonymous with the whole spectrum of temperature ranges, right? You might be out and shooting hogs or whatever it is in the middle of summer, down south where it's super hot, and you might be up where we're at in the Midwest or out in the western states when it's freezing cold, chasing coyotes in the wintertime. That's a broad range that a guy needs to be able to see, will this bullet work in his system in? And there's generalized twist rate recommendations on the box. Like you buy a box of bullets, it's going to say, 1 in 8 twist or whatever, 1 in 10 twist. That doesn't mean that's the only twist rate that can be used in. To your point, Mark, like as you go up in altitude, the air density automatically starts to drop off because there's less air pressure up there. You still have it changing with temperature, right? So high altitude, low temperature is going to be more dense air. But let's say it's a guy that's going to go on a prairie dog shoot on a mountaintop in Wyoming. That bullet out of his twist barrel might be completely stable in the summertime in Wyoming, but he takes that exact same system and goes to Wisconsin in the wintertime, or Michigan, right? Low elevation, so higher air pressure, cold temperature, higher air density, those two things in combination, his bullet might not be stable anymore. And so the general recommendations that you see are a good guideline, but if you want to know specifically what the application is, you need to calculate the stability.
A lot to unpack there, Mark.
There's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot more to bullet stability than I knew there was going to be. A lot. There's more than I initially thought, though.
Sure. Shape, mass, material sciences. Yeah. What if you had like something denser than lead, so tungsten? Your bullet length doesn't change. We'd still have to increase twist, right? So if we were to take a 140 ELDM, remove its lead core and insert a tungsten core, we don't change the profile, the length, or the shape of the bullet or anything like it. We should expect that we need to twist that considerably faster, though, because it's mass. is now greater?
Depends on where how the mass influences the center of gravity.
Okay, so we have the same answer
Remember,
on our podcast. It depends.
It all goes back to that center of pressure, center of gravity, and that pry bar length, and the strength pushing on it. That is bullet stability. So if I go change the core out, that's going to probably change where the center of gravity is. It could, right? The relationship between those two is what you really need to know.
Understood. It's not so linear then.
And then you're also going to have changes to the other things that matter for bullet stability. The inertial characteristics are going to change as you change mass, and the pitching moment coefficient is likely going to change a little bit because of those mass changes. So it's not just that basic example, it's a little deeper.
Sure.
Ryan, I'm out of stability questions.
You got a stability, Mark? You're unstable.
I'm
right
unstable right now. I'm digesting all this information, and frankly, I'm a little unstable.
You touched on this a little bit with respect to terminal performance, and there's a couple of examples of a cartridge now being twisted hyper fast, and that's like 1 in 3, 1 in 5, 1 in 6. And I know you do quite a bit of hunting, and you're also an avid just shooter, tinker, reloader, and a ballistician by trade. And I've heard this, and I don't know how to, either discredit or substantiate it. But is if you had a bullet that could hold together under such an extraordinary twist rate, as say 1 in 3, 1 in 5, 1 in 6, is that giving you, aside from the point at which the bullet will come to full deployment, an advantage being pushed through a soft target from like a terminal perspective? Meaning, if previously we subscribed to energy and velocities being the things to look at that kill, and everybody's got kind of a different opinion on this, and we've chatted with you on that, like, oh, you got to have 10,000 foot-pounds of energy to drop that thing in its tracks, or you got to have an impact velocity of 4,000 feet per second to institute hydrostatic shock and blow up organs. If you had a relatively slow projectile moving extraordinarily fast, does that introduce some sort of additional category of killing power?
So the rate at which the bullet expands can be influenced by both impact velocity, how fast the bullet is moving when it impacts the material, and the spin rate of the bullet on impact. So if you took one of those and jacked it way up, let's say spin rate, we made it spin way, way faster, it's going to expand way, way sooner. So you, in theory, could compensate for less velocity, but still getting the bullet to expand as much as it would have at a higher velocity because you've increased the spin rate so much.
Certainly.
That is theoretically possible. Typically what you see is trade-offs start to show up somewhere else. So to get to those levels, because the other thing you have happening is what's called spin decay. So that the let's call it RPMs, like an engine, right? Revolutions per minute. The RPMs that the bullet has when it comes out of the muzzle, most stuff is going to be in the 200,000s for the majority of stuff. So let's just pick a number, 250,000 RPMs when the bullet comes out of the muzzle. It's going 3,000 feet per second, 250,000 RPMs. As that bullet moves down range, velocity starts to bleed off pretty rapidly, right? By 500 yards, it might only have 2,000 feet per second left of velocity. It lost a third of its velocity. The spin rate at 500 yards is going to be 240,000 RPMs. So it barely loses any rotational speed, right? There's not much drag on that. And so if you're going to compensate for lower impact velocity by increasing the twist rate, you now make it more sensitive to everything inside of that. You tried to fix a low-end solution with a method that now means as you increase that velocity, that thing is still spinning, super fast. You're likely going to have problems with your higher velocity impacts at that point. Because from a bullet design standpoint, if you designed it primarily to the expansion mechanism was a rotation, you you are likely boxing yourself in to not have a huge range envelope because the velocity is changing so much on that end. It's kind of tough. It's a hard sweet spot to find. And then the other thing that you run into is the integrity issue. And I have seen that with, the kind of the twist rates you're talking about, where if you shoot a solid or a monolithic style bullet, say one of our CX bullets or a Barnes bullet or some lathe turned solid bullet, yeah, those for the most part don't experience any issues. But a guy that doesn't know this much about stability or twist rates and stuff, he just thinks it's cool and goes and buys it, and he wants to load a copper core or a lead core copper jacketed bullet because they're significantly lower priced, right? From a material standpoint, copper is expensive. So you see those solid or monolithic material bullets become more expensive. So this guy goes and gets some lead core copper jacketed bullets and shoots them through there. And I've seen bullets essentially be compromised in bore, and as soon as they come out, they're shotgunning, and I've seen them do it in suppressors.
Oh.
Which is a bad day.
Yeah.
So that's where it's so important to have some level of understanding of all of these things so that you can pick the trade-offs where it's applicable for you, because there might be an application where that is what you want. You want that super fast twist rate and that compensation for bullet expansion from rotation instead of impact velocity. That might exist, and that's fine if you live within the limitations of that. But when you try to take that and then do something else with it, things can go differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like that'd be a pretty specialized application. Like you said, at least for me, for hunting, like I want that envelope as broad as possible,
Yep.
Because I encounter shots at 20 yards to, however far, right?
Yep.
But that's all interesting stuff, though.
Mm.
To put it another way, after I was thinking about what I kind of just said, I think it's easier to build a bullet that is reliable and controllable from an expansion standpoint based more on the impact velocity than it is depending on rotational, acceleration to get it to open. It's easier to do it the other way.
100%. Jayden, did we leave anything on the table as far as talking about stability?
We didn't talk about spindrift, the old
and we
can
opened
of
with
beverage
it.
there. You did. The podcast probably wouldn't be complete without a proper closing based on the opening, right?
Exactly. I think that's how a story works, right? What's going on with spindrift then?
So spindrift happens because the bullet is spinning. Who would have thought, right? So if you didn't have any bullet spin, you wouldn't have any of that drift that we observe. The faster the bullet is spinning, and so the faster the twist rate becomes, and the more drop that the bullet has due to gravity, the more spin drift you will observe.
We still get this question fairly routinely when folks are modeling through our ballistics calculator, and they'll say, hey, I have a 0 wind condition in the calculator, but I'm noticing that I have windage correction compounding as I go out further, like the calculator's broken. In fact, what they're observing is spin drift.
That's right.
Yeah. A question on that. If we looked at the shape of a projectile and we saw something that had like a very short bearing surface, compare it to something that has a very long bearing surface or is a longer projectile, does that layout of the projectile go into either the exacerbation or mitigation of spin drift?
Not really.
Okay.
Spin drift comes from when I was kind of describing earlier with the curveball from the pitcher and that airflow that's attached and it's kind of crashing into the stuff at the bottom because the bullet's dropping due to gravity and there's more pressure down there. That's where spin drift comes from. So if you took a child's top, that's also a gyroscopically stabilized object, right? And you spin it on the table and you tapped it with your finger away from you, the top would move away from you because you tapped it, but it'll also move 90 degrees from where you tapped it. Because when a force is applied to a gyroscope, it responds, the gyroscope's response is 90 degrees from that force or that orientation. So spin drift comes from the fact that as the bullet's falling more and more and more and more, there's more pressure on the bottom than the top, and that can create a force component. If it's a right-hand spinning bullet, the bullet's going to respond 90 degrees from the force being applied. Well, the force being applied is the bottom, 6 o'clock position, right? So a gyroscope will always respond 90 degrees upstream of the rotation. So from a right-hand spinning bullet, if you're looking at it from the back side, that means it's going to respond to the right, because upstream would be the opposite direction of the rotation, right? So what you see happen is the bullet's nose will point to the right slightly. It doesn't just point there and stay there, but as it's wobbling about, it will wobble farther to the right than it will to the left, and it spends a little bit more time over there. And so the more it drifts, the more to the right it goes, or the more it drops, the more to the right it goes. The more to the right it goes, the more drift you see on target.
Understood.
That's why you don't really see the spin drift at 100, because the bullet hasn't, or out to 100, because the bullet hasn't dropped much. There's not much pressure difference there that's causing it to point its nose to the right. And if you got a left-hand twist barrel, you would see the nose orientation go left, and your spin drift would be in the left-hand direction.
Understood. And then perhaps another, I'm not going to say it's a myth because I don't actually know whether it's true or not. Like individual rifle bores and say like the depth of engraving that we see out of lands and grooves, if hypothetically we had a barrel that had a taller land and it put a larger engraved mark on that bullet, does that exacerbate the effects of twist rate, like giving the bullet almost like a shovel or a paddle that it's able to dig at that air with? Do we see an immediate like increase in twist rate on that alone, or is there just too many things to think about there and too many other variables at play?
Yeah, I think it's probably eclipsed by many other things that are more observable. Does it make a difference? Yeah, I'm sure it has to at some level. I think a lot of that is lost in that skin friction, or that boundary air layer that's around there. We haven't observed significant differences there in the testing that we've done. I mean, you might be able to see something or another, but it's grossly eclipsed by velocity variation, by shooter error, all those kind of things.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Cool.
You've brought up shooter error a couple times. What is that? I just haven't personally.
I read about it on Instagram. That's you read on Instagram, right? Isn't it like a ebook website or something?
Yeah. Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, shooter error, the often responsible but unaccounted for variable,
if not totally impossible to find in many cases. It's kind of like the transonic gremlins.
Yeah. All you got to do is start packing a mirror in your gun case when you go to the range.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've pinpointed the problem.
I like that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, that's fun.
Jayden, thank you, man. This was
You bet.
this was really cool.
Yeah.
This topic is one where people are kind of quasi familiar with.
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, let's go into it a little bit, and then you're like drowning in weeds, and it's like, holy cow.
Well, I think it's super important and timely too, because like with 7 PRCs, this is a great example. You folks released like the new 160 CX. Like this isn't the bullet that the shooter with the 708 or the 7 Rem Mag, box stock gun from 2 decades ago is going to want to put in their gun. Mostly because of twist rate. There's a high likelihood your 708 Remington is not going to accommodate that projectile, in the first place. And so it is important to be cognitive of what goes into bullet stability before you're making your selection from the hand loading shop shelf. And that's not a bullet that you folks offer as a pairing anyways in that cartridge, and intelligently so, because there are no factory 708s out there that I'm aware of that can accommodate a projectile like that, or like the 180 ELD, something along those lines. But yeah, neat.
Very neat.
Yeah.
Lots to ponder here.
Yes.
Sometimes knowledge is power, and
Yeah.
I'm glad I know that. And then right now I'm like, man.
Sometimes knowledge makes you unstable.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I had to do it again.
Exactly. Well, cool, man. Well, we appreciate the time, all the information. It's always just so enlightening and eye-opening, and just cool to hear, really just the science and physics behind a lot of this stuff, and the why behind our bullets are doing what they're doing. So thank you so much for that.
Really enjoy getting your twist on things.
Oh, I see what you did there.
Yeah, see, usually Mark comes up with those.
That was solid.
Thanks, Mark.
That was that's beautiful.
Pretty good about that.
Gosh.
I can't follow that. I'm done now.
I'm about ready to go buy myself a pair of New Balances and some nice Stonewash jeans now because of that.
I don't wear New Balances or Stonewash jeans.
Well, you know what I'm saying. It goes with your dad jokes. They're always really good.
Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough. We'll end on that. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks again, Jayden. Thank you, Ryan. Until next time, we'll catch you on the next one.
See you.
Bye.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.